Did you enjoy doing the sewing then?
Well, we had to do it. We didn't ask whether we enjoyed it or not. Passed the time for us, you know.
To sit and work with the like of that with a paraffin oil lamp in the middle of the table.
You had a hem at first before you started the fancy work. Only they were hard to do and very, very poorly paid. You could fix them off for it. I don't think it would have been a sixpence each.
Irish embroiderers have for centuries produced some of the most beautiful decorative work to be found anywhere in the world. Embroidery is any type of decoration in which thread is applied to fabric. Many Irish laces are therefore forms of embroidery. In Ireland, embroidery has always been admired and highly valued. 1,000 years ago, under the Brehon laws, there was a fine of an ounce of silver as punishment for stealing an embroidery needle. The flax plant supplies the raw material for linen, the perfect base for embroidery work, and it has been extensively grown in Ireland for centuries. It originally supported rural communities at a time when flax was spun by hand and woven in the home. The mechanisation of linen production in the middle of the 19th century brought huge quantities of the fabric onto the market. A lot of this material needed to be decorated, and this led to the growth and expansion of an important embroidery industry. Belfast became the main centre for linen production, where vast mills carried out the work of spinning, reeling and weaving the flax into cloth. Linen fabric has again become fashionable, but most of the raw flax is now unfortunately imported from Belgium and Russia. Eden Dairy Mill, once the largest in Ulster, and the adjacent Ewerts Mill are among the many which have closed, and the large workforce living nearby has had to seek other employment. By the beginning of the 19th century in Ireland, embroidery was becoming organised on a commercial basis through a system of agents. And one of the first types of embroidery to be treated in this way was known as Ayrshire work. As the name suggests, Ayrshire work came originally from Scotland. It's believed to have been developed by a Mrs. Jameson, the wife of an embroidery agent who probably unpicked a piece of French embroidery to discover the stitches. This magnificent christening robe shows the characteristics of Ayrshire work. Beautiful designs on natural themes, densely packed minute stitches, and a wide range of individual filling stitches worked within holes pierced in the fabric. Ayrshire work first appeared in the Ards Peninsula. When it began to go out of fashion, the region remained a stronghold of embroidery, and the work was done by the wives of fishermen in villages like Ballywalter. Today, a handful of embroideresses or flowerers like Mrs. Buick still use the skills learned at their mother's knee. The famous peacock cloth is now part of the collection belonging to the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum. The designer was a Belfast artist, and several women from the Ards Peninsula were involved in the embroidery. One of them was Martha Cooper, who was married to a Donaghadee fisherman. Thelma Goldring works a typical white embroidery pattern. Sewing of this type was known by several different names. Parcelling refers to the packages distributed by agents. Although flowering and sprigging are descriptive, the designs included many different subjects. Here, Thelma shows the characteristic flowering stitches, raised satin stitch with couching. A padding of long stitches is worked first for raised satin stitch. In couching, a thread is laid down and oversewn into position, making the stems of the flowers. Thelma's needlework tools include a fine selection of bone stilettos. Thelma's grandmother also did exquisite embroidery, and Thelma herself was a well-known needlewoman whose work is widely admired. She has made a very important contribution to the revival of interest in needle skills and has taught many people to embroider. Dicing is a type of shadow work found in the Ballynahinch area of County Down. It is worked on the back of the fabric to produce an embossed design on the face. The best quality flowering was highly specialised. Decorating a handkerchief of this standard might involve as many as 7 people, each working a particular stitch type. It was the railway system of the mid-1800s that allowed the embroidery agents of Belfast and Dublin access to South Donegal, where there was an available workforce. Jack Fury of Mount Charles runs an embroidery business, which he took over some years ago from his wife. The embroidery is done by women outworkers in their own homes. In the mid-19th century, more than 250,000 women in the northern half of Ireland were employed at embroidery. Very often, daughters helped mothers, and little girls helped with simple decorative sewing when they came home from school. Mr. Fury buys materials from wholesalers and supplies his workers with fabrics and white and coloured threads. In the past, he supplied major retailers such as Robinson and Cleaver in Belfast and Walpole's in Dublin. As well as selling finished work, Mr. Fury prepares fabric for decoration. The lines of the designs are marked out with rows of tiny perforations. Blue composition he has mixed himself is carefully pressed through these holes, skillfully transferring the pattern without smudging into precisely the right position on the cloth. Mr. Fury's stock includes high-quality threads which for some time have been difficult to obtain. However, thread manufacturers are again beginning to turn their attention to the demands of fine embroidery. Earlier this century, many Donegal girls were attracted to linen centres like Lurgan, and women from the Ards and other areas moved to Belfast to work in needlework factories, tempted by regular wages and the excitement of city life. Many of the designs used by Mr. Fury were drawn long ago and are now accepted as traditional. These patterns, worked on ecru, on bleached linen, echo the designs of the Celtic revival of a century ago and show the influence of the Donemer Guild of Embroiderers. Lily, sister of the poet W.B. Yeats, was a leading member of this group. Maggie Cares of Frosses enjoys working on her embroidery in the Donegal sunshine. Coloured work is less highly regarded than white embroidery, which is surprising, but it may have been because chemical dyes produced garish colours which contrasted badly with the more subtle white work. Mountmellick is the home of a type of white embroidery which originated about 1830. The Quaker settlement had a long association with textile production, and embroidery was a natural development. Mary Wilson prepares her work by tracing her pattern onto her fabric with a carbon paper sandwich. Mountmellick work has recently become very popular again and has been enthusiastically revived in several places, including the town of Mountmellick itself. In the 19th century, it was also produced in many centres. For example, there was a small factory in Hollywood, County Down. Patterns are drawn from nature, traced from illustrations, or copied from antique examples. The embroidery is worked on a heavy satinised cotton fabric known as jean, because it is said to have been made originally in Geneva. Good hoops are really vital when you're working a piece of embroidery. They must be smooth, they must fit well to hold the work firmly. In the past, they were often specially made for a girl by her father or maybe by a boyfriend, usually of sally rods. Over the last 10 years or so, there has been a tremendous revival of interest in embroidery. Increased leisure time, whether as a result of unemployment or as a consequence of increased mechanisation of working practices, has led to a renaissance not only of embroidery, but also of all sorts of traditional crafts and skills. The designs for Mount Mellick work are large-scale and dramatic and use a wide variety of stitches, some of which, like the stem stitch, are used in other types of embroidery. Cable stitch, which Mary uses to outline a leaf, is also typical of Mount Mellick embroidery. Mary uses a thick, unmercerised cotton thread, which gives a matte finish, complementing the sheen of the fabric. Any type of white thread may be used for the heavy padding of the exaggerated raised satin stitch, characteristic of Mount Mellick work. Mount Mellick work always uses naturalistic designs and is worked with minimal stylisation. This is the characteristic Mount Mellick stitch. Other stitches include wheatear, spiderweb, coral and worms. Mount Mellick work was developed by a woman called Johanna Carter. Like many types of needlework, it sometimes provided relief employment for women in times of economic hardship. Its durable nature made it very popular in the Victorian home, and while much was commercially produced, it was also enjoyed as a hobby. In this type of embroidery, Mary's skill as a knitter is also essential. Finished Mount Mellick work is usually edged with a knitted fringe. In the past, Newry, County Down, was famous for its embroidery. Irish convents played an important part in the teaching of embroidery, and some of the most magnificent was produced in the Convent of Mercy. Many nuns were well aware that to maintain a strong position in the market, good commercial organisation was vital, along with the highest standards of imaginative design. Today, the sewing school is no longer, but the Convent of Mercy still houses a grammar school. In the early 20th century, the industry, then known as Clanrye embroidery, was organised by Sister Camillus, who specialised in dramatic designs worked in cut linen. Sister Camillus' work is still treasured at the convent, where it is used during special religious ceremonies. The magnificent work is made up of motifs of sewn linen, cut from the fabric, arranged in a pattern and joined by needlepoint bars or brides. Today, Sister Rose McMullen cares for this outstanding collection. Many types of embroidery and lace were taught at special sewing schools, often attached to convents. These also acted as agencies, supplying outworkers and selling their products. The Newry collection includes magnificent drawn threadwork, characteristic of this part of County Down. This is a superbly executed and designed piece of work, done on the most beautiful quality linen. The largest of these wonderful cameos measures no more than 2 inches square. Only the most perfect needlework can capture these delightful and minute designs worked on the finest muslin. Heather Crawford is a leader in the recent revival of the craft of sampler making, which is a very old skill. It was popular in Ireland in the last century when a sampler was a piece of needlework sewn by a child to demonstrate the skills and stitches she learned in school.
Children's embroidery has always had great appeal for me. From about 1835 in Ireland, the majority of needlework samplers were produced in the national schools. When I came to make my own pattern, I had to go back to the old samplers, mainly in the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum, to copy out patterns stitch by stitch. This is difficult work, and it generally involves using a magnifying glass, since the stitches are so small. The pattern range that's available in old samplers is far beyond anything you can find in the modern printed patterns. I use tapestry needles. The size varies with the weight of fabric you're stitching and the number of strands of embroidery cotton which you intend to use for each stitch. In this particular piece, I've already spent 58 hours. That includes 3 hours in setting up the frame and about 5 for drawing up the pattern on the graph paper. I mark them out onto a large sheet of metric graph paper with one little cross indicating each stitch. When I'm setting up the frame, the first thing I do is to stitch the canvas using a button thread to the tapes on one of the long sides, and then I stretch it out to the other side and stitch again. I tension the top and the bottom of the canvas by looping it with button thread along both ends. The advantage of using canvas in a frame is that you can use both hands, whereas in a hoop you have to hold a hoop with one hand and alternate between the back and the front of the work with the other. This is an early Irish sampler. Hannah Leach has made it in Enniscorthy, County Wexford, in the 14th year of her age, in 1797. The most interesting feature is the line of diamond shapes across the very bottom edge, all beautifully sewn in rococo stitch. The sampler is worked on linen using silk thread, and with its floral border comprises all the elements that you would expect to find in a typical teaching sampler.
Soon after the turn of the present century, Irish embroidery began to be mechanised. This work is known as Swiss embroidery. The needles pass through the fabric from one set of jaws to the other, stitching the design. The pantograph controls the design. The pedals control the jaws in which the needles are held. Thomas Ferguson initials handkerchiefs several dozen at a time, producing work with precision and speed to match the latest computerised version. This machine was built in 1896 in Arbonne, Switzerland. The handkerchiefs are held in place by steel frames mounted in detachable wooden racks. When areas of embroidery became mechanised, a reversal of roles occurred. The men did the mechanical stitching, with women assisting. Thomas is helped by Joan Knox and by his wife Charlotte. The special double-pointed needles have eyes in the centre. Shaking them removes any remaining fragments of thread from the eyes. The threading machine can be set to supply each needle with exactly the right length of thread. Some Swiss embroiderers think that the regularity of the stitching makes it superior to hand-done work. The machine is capable of many types of fine work, although for economic reasons these are rarely if ever attempted today. Operating the machine demands considerable skill and concentration. A small lapse could cause a snag, which might result in the whole batch of work being spoiled. Swiss embroidery is superficially very similar to the Ayrshire work it helped to displace. It was used for infants' garments, such as christening robes, and in the petticoats and beautiful camisoles of the early 20th century. Another type of embroidery which was very popular in the past was drawn thread work. And it's perhaps the most dramatic, the most immediately spectacular of all embroidery. This piece was a bed cover, and it might have been kept for best use, depending on the type of the household. It might have been used every day, or it might have been used specifically for the laying out of the dead. The work is done by actually removing threads and then stitching the remaining threads into the individual designs. Valerie Wilson, a highly talented needlewoman, prepares a piece of drawn thread work.
After the fabric has been stretched into hoop for easier working, I would normally cut into the fabric with a small, sharp pair of scissors where I want to place the band of stitches, cutting through the threads in one direction only. In the past, cotton and linen were the fabrics most often used, and they're still the best today because they're strong and the threads are easily pulled out. But you can use any even weave fabric, including raw silk and even wool. I'm using a cream even weave linen. In the old days, it was quite common for women to reuse the threads that they'd pulled out of the original fabric. But nowadays, an embroidery cotton or even a fine crochet cotton will be used for the stitches. I learned most of the stitches from my grandmother because she had done a lot of drawn thread work in her younger days and in fact used to take prizes at agricultural fairs for her work. The first stitch and the most simple one, especially the one that young girls would have been taught in school, was the spoking or hem stitching, whereby a small number of threads would be gathered into even bunches or straight bars, and these would very often be found trimming pillowcases, bed linens and even clothing, including christening robes. It could also have ribbons or ornamental threads woven in and out of these bars. This is serpentine stitch, which is worked along the same lines as spoking, but produces a chevron or zigzag pattern. The twisted bar or doily stitch is worked over the basic spoking with a thread taken down the centre, over one bar and under the other, and twisted tight. Needle weaving is a process whereby a thicker thread, or sometimes a coloured thread, was woven under and over 2 bars or more at a time, and very often produced bolder and more dramatic patterns on the work.
You had to have the linen, you know. You couldn't draw the threads out of any cotton or anything.
Now, who did this one?
My mother's sister did that one. Do you remember Aunt Maggie did that when she lived with us one time?
I don't know what that
Don't
is.
remember that. It's not linen. It's only an old piece of cloth somebody gave me, and it vexes me to think of the work that went into it. Aunt Maggie did this, didn't she?
Yes.
Aunt Maggie did this.
Yeah.
And she wasn't married, so she didn't have any other outside interests, and she used to sit and do this embroidery work all the time. She did pieces for all of us.
Only wee boys' pair trousers.
This was done. This was
This was just done for the family, for presents.
right.
Well, in my mother's day, it was mostly drawn thread work. It was just whenever we came along that they wanted to do this for our bottom drawers, and then that's when they moved into the coloured stuff. The girls all had to have a good, well-filled bottom drawer with pillowcases, tea towels, and hand-embroidered tablecloths.
Whose bottom drawer did this come
That
from?
came
then?
from mine.
Lovely. And there's another really lovely one here.
Yeah. That is mine. It belonged to my sister-in-law. She, of course, had that done. She did that herself for her bottom drawer when she was a teenager.
That's,
Isn't that lovely? The colours are beautiful.
aren't they?
Yes.
Aren't
We were all hoping we'd get married someday, so we all did this sort of work. We sat in the winter time, because we were never allowed to go to dances or anything, and we sat in the house and did this embroidery work. Isn't that right?
That's
they? So you passed on your skills to your daughters
Yes.
then?
It's lovely when a special occasion, family births or anything, we used to dress the table and have that on, and a bowl of daffodils in the middle. Looked very well.
I'm
And
sure.
there's tea and everything spilled in that.
Hard to believe,
It's
isn't
hard
it?
to
It
believe,
looks
yes.
as if it has
Where
just
did you
been
get it
done.
so white, Ethel?